Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's video explores an alternate version of events and characters in a reimagined storyline. This presentation is structured and adopted into an audiobook style format with narration and visuals to enhance the experience. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the story.
The prince looked handsome, dressed as he was in the red and black of his house. Joanna remembered him as a babe. He had been a small child, and one who was constantly tottering to one book or another. If Joanna could remember correctly, Prince Wrecker had been able to speak by the time he was a year old, and able to read properly by the time he was 3. He had always been a smart child, and now he was growing into a fine young man. He would make a good husband for Cersei. Of course, Cersei was staring open-mouthed out the window of the carriage as they traveled through the city. King's Landing was a sprawling heap of buildings, shit, and gold. It was not as impressive as Lannisport, but Aerys had made many changes since coming to power. The piles of shit had been moved, replaced by glowing structures that reflected the grandiosity with which Aerys viewed his dynasty. There were statues of dragons and the Dragon Kings everywhere. It was somewhat nauseating if she were being honest. She was surprised neither Jaime or Cersei were saying much, but then again, seeing the capital of the Seven Kingdoms was always enough to keep her quiet with awe, so why should it not be the same for her children? She looked outside the window of the carriage and saw Eddard staring at the buildings with the same expression of awe that the children had. Coming from the north, all this extravagance must have been a lot for him to take in. They wound their way up Aegon's high hill. People were out in force to look and gape. The hand of the king had returned, and so had his wife and family. No doubt the people would talk about this for a long time. It was important to come in all finery when coming to the capital. The king and queen respected such things, more than their father and mother had done. Joanna smiled slightly as she thought about the queen. Riel was a smart woman, with a sharp tongue and an even sharper mind. She was looking forward to seeing her again. Eventually, the carriage stopped as they reached the top of Aegon's high hill. She could hear Tywin speaking to someone. No doubt, it was the king. The door to the carriage opened, and the children stepped out. Then Joanna did. As she stepped out of the carriage, she heard Aegir say, and here she is. The woman of the moment. Joanna repressed a shudder and plastered a smile on her face. She walked with Jaime and Cersei's hands in hers. She stopped next to Tywin and curtsied. Jaime bowed and Cersei curtsied. "Your Majesties, it is an honor," Joanna said. She smiled at Ricciello, who was dressed in red and black with her hair tied back in a bow. She was relieved when Ricciello smiled back at her. They had not parted on the best of terms. "Welcome to King's Landing and to the Red Keep, Lord and Lady Lannister," Yaris said formally. Joanna looked at him and saw that his hair was long and free-flowing. There was a cheeky glint in his eye that she remembered from childhood. Yaris kissed her hand and then stepped back and said, "You have met my son, Prince Rhaegar. Now I think it fair that I introduce you to my daughters." Something about the way Aerys said the word daughters made Joanna think that he was not happy to have 2 daughters. That was useful information. She could use that. 2 girls stepped forward and curtsied to them. The taller girl looked slightly wary, but smiled when her father introduced her. "This is my daughter, Princess Shaina." Another girl, smaller and younger, about Jaime's age, stepped forward then. "And this is my daughter, Daenerys." The way Aerys said her name made Joanna think that he did not like Daenerys. A reminder that he did not have a spare son. Good, they could make use of that. She saw Jaime gaping at Daenerys out the corner of her eye and smiled some more. They could definitely use that. It fell to Joanna to introduce their children. "This is our eldest son and heir, Jaime." Jaime bowed before the king and queen. Aerys smiled, something glinting in his eyes that Joanna did not like. Cersei stepped forward and curtsied, like the proper lady she was. "And this is our daughter, Cersei." Rosiella smiled then. Jarrix clapped his hands. "Very well, Tywin. I hear you have Lord Rickard's son with you as well. Where is he?" They had expected this, and therefore, when Tywin gestured, Eddard stepped forward and bowed. "This is Eddard Stark, second son of Lord Rickard Stark," Tywin said. Eddard was dressed in red and gray, a mix of Lannister and Stark colors. Yarix looked the boy up and down before nodding. "I see they've already got you dressed like a Lannister," Tell me, boy, how is your father? Eddard stiffened slightly before replying. He is well, your majesty, he wrote to me to tell you. He sends his regards. Joanna smiled. That was well played. Lord Rickard had said no such thing, and if he had done so, Joanna would have known. Eddard told her almost everything. The king merely nodded. Very well, there was a pause. And then the king clapped his hands. Well, I trust that you will be tired. A long journey, I shall have you escorted to your rooms and then prepared for the evening festivities. With that, Aerys sparked out a series of commands, and they found their things being taken from the horses and carriages to the rooms within the Red Keep. As Tywin walked with Aerys, Rella walked with her. They walked in companionable silence until they stopped at a big room with 2 beds, one for each of the twins. Rella smiled and walked away. As she got the children settled down, Jaime spoke. The Red Keep is huge, Joanna smiled. Not as big as the Rock, though. Cersei replied haughtily. Joanna's smile disappeared slightly. Then Cersei would need to learn to keep such thoughts to herself at the evening meal. Aerys would not react well to such comments, and it was important that Aerys liked Cersei, if he were to ever consider having her be married to Rhaegar. Thankfully, Cersei did not elaborate, and Jaime instead asked, Mama, didn't you live in the Red Keep for a while when you were littler? Joanna smiled. I did. From the time I was your age to the time when I married your father. You served as Queen Rhaegalla's lady-in-waiting. Didn't you, Mama? Cersei asked then, her eyes large with interest. Joanna nodded, her mind playing back the argument that she and Rosetta had the last day that she had been in King's Landing, and how Aerys had been the cause of it all. She could tell her children were looking at her expectantly, and so she smiled and said, We were the best of friends. We had our lessons together, and we played pranks on the king and on Tywin and on Stefan. It was a fun time. Did you stop being Queen Rhaegalla's lady-in-waiting because you married Papa? Cersei asked. Joanna thought about the question for a moment. The honest answer was no, but she could not say that. Not now. So instead, she nodded her head and said, Yes, I was needed at the Rock. As Lord Tydos, your grandfather did not have a wife, and there were some things at the Rock that needed a lady's touch. That was true as well. Lord Tydos had allowed his whore to take control, and she had nearly bankrupted the Rock with her messiness. Jaime yawned then. When is the evening meal, Mama? Joanna kissed his brow and said, Not for some time yet, my love. Sleep, I will come and wake you when it is time for you to get ready. She kissed both their brows and then stood up and watched as they snuggled into their beds. She hoped that they would not do anything untoward, or rather that Cersei would not try anything of the such. Jaime was too good to say no if his sister asked. She closed the door and nodded to the guards who wore the red of the Rock outside the door, and made her way to Eddard's room. Their ward was sat on the bed, reading a book as she had expected. She knocked on the door, and he stood up. How are you feeling? She asked. Eddard hesitated for a moment. It was something he did often, as if he was not sure what he was, and was not allowed to say. Not for the first time, Joanna wondered what sort of household Lord Rickard ran in the north. Eventually, Eddard spoke. I am well, my lady, truly, a little tired. He held up the book in his hand, but I have found something to keep me occupied until the time comes for the evening meal. Joanna smiled. Eddard was always reading something or the other, and because of him, Jaime was also improving his ability to read. Very well, I will come and knock on your door when it is time to get ready for the evening meal. Eddard nodded, and she turned and walked from his room. She walked down the hallway, memories playing in her head, the ghosts of the past. Seeing herself and Rhaegal playing hide-and-seek with Aerys and Tywin before Stefan had come, and then playing knights and maidens when Stefan was here. She remembered sitting on her father's knee when he had come to visit and had exchanged stories with Prince Daeron. She smiled at the thought, and then made her way over to her and Tywin's rooms. Her husband was sat reading a letter of some sort, but stopped when he saw her. He raised an eyebrow in silent question, and she nodded. The children are asleep. Tywin nodded, relieved. Good. They need the rest. Jaina looked at the letter on the table and asked, What is that? Tywin sighed. Averts gave it to me when we went walking. Something from Braavos. They are demanding that the throne repay the loan that King Jaehaerys had taken out immediately. I think they are concerned about the king's alliance with Volantis. What is Aerys saying? Joanna asked, though she had a rough idea of what the king of the Seven Kingdoms would say to such a threat. He wants to go to war with Braavos. No matter how ill-advised that would be right now, I am trying to think of a way to ensure that he gets what he wants, and that the Iron Bank gets what it wants. Otherwise, we will be facing the Faceless Men. Tywin said. You think it would get to that point? Joanna asked, surprised. With the Daenerys, her husband said. Yes, definitely. He would rather die than fork over anything to former slaves of Valyria. Her husband sighed and then pushed the letter away from himself. He grabbed her hands and she followed him into his lap. You know he wants to rebuild the King's Road. Again. Joanna laughed. It does make sense. The King's Road is a broken husk of a thing. Not worth its title. Her husband nodded his agreement, but then sighed. Eurystheus would change his mind before the project could properly begin. And if he did by some miracle agree to have it happen, partway through he would change his mind, and then we would all be in danger. Then, Joanna exhaled. Her husband spoke the truth. Aerys was changeable. Always had been. A sign of his father in him that he never liked. Deciding that, for the moment, that Aerys could be forgotten, she got of her husband's lap and pulled him to the bed. He came without complaint, and they lay down on the bed. They both closed their eyes and slept for some time. It was a welcome break. Some time later, there was a knock on the door. Joanna got up and looked at the guard who had knocked and heard him say, There is an hour until the feast, my lady. Joanna nodded. Tywin was already awake and getting up. Joanna decided that she would go and get the children ready first, and then herself. She moved past the guard and out into the hallway. Memories did not greet her this time, and that was a relief. She walked quickly, past guards wearing red and gold, stopping first at Eddard's room. He was dressed already in a red and gray doublet with trimmings of gold. He looked handsome, and he blushed when she told him so. She smiled and walked on toward the twins' room. She opened the door and found them up and getting changed. She watched silently for a moment as they helped each other put their clothes on and wondered what it would be like if they were always this neat and tidy and active. Jaime was the first one to notice her. Look, Mama, he cried out. I'm got changed all by myself. Before Joanna could reply, Cyr said, I help. Joanna smiled and said, I can see that. Are you both ready? Casterly looked at himself and nodded. Cersei looked at herself and nodded. Casterly was wearing a red and gold doublet with breeches, whilst Cersei wore a golden dress. Do you want me to do your hair, Cersei? Joanna asked. Yes, please, Mama, Cersei exclaimed. Good. Move to the dresser, then. Joanna said, and Cersei did as bid. Sat before the big mirror. Joanna took the clips from the box on the table and began plaiting her daughter's hair. As she did so, she heard Jaime say, I'm going to see Ned. The door opened and then closed. In the silence, Joanna did her daughter's hair, and then when that was done, she kissed the top of Cersei's head and took her to Eddard's room, leaving her there with her brothers before walking back to her own room. She changed out of the clothes she had worn whilst traveling and got changed into a midnight blue gown with an amethyst necklace. She smiled when Tywin's mouth dropped open. Together they walked out of the room, and Joanna smiled when her children said, You look beautiful, Mama. As a group, they walked toward the throne room, where the king and queen and their children were waiting for them. Rhaenyra said nothing as he took her arm and linked it with his. The herald announced them, and they walked through the open doors. King's guard on either side of them. The throne room fell silent as they walked in. Aerys led her to her seat, which was to his left. Tywin was to his right, and Rhaenyra was to his right. A speech was made, and then they began tucking into the food. The starters were bread with wine and cheese. It was a standard dish for King's Landing, but then there was a second main, which was duck rolls. Now this was new. No doubt Rhaenyra wanted to try something new. She doubted Aerys would be able to remember anything new to do with food. She let out an appreciative sigh, and Aerys surprised her by saying, I remember you liked duck as a child. I did, Your Majesty. It is such a rarity in Casterly Rock and Lannisport, Joanna replied. Then you should spend more time here at court. Then you can have all the duck you wish to have. Aerys replied glibly. Joanna smiled sweetly at him. I will be here with my husband and children for around 2 weeks. I am sure by then I would have had my fill of duck. She was surprised when Aerys laughed. Normally he would have snarled at her for that comment. Well then, that will be the day, then. There was a moment of silence, and then the king spoke once more. How have you been? Truly. For a moment, Joanna considered the eyes of the king and saw the earnest boy he had been. She smiled at that boy and said, I have been well enough. Your Majesty, thank you. I am enjoying life at the Rock and raising my children." The king nodded. "I know that Lord Rickard originally wanted his son to foster with Jon Arryn, but I advised him to send the boy to Tywin and you. I thought it would do him more good. How is he settling in?" This was new information to her. She had been under the impression that Lord Rickard had written to Tywin directly, but to ensure that Aerys did not think that he had caught her off guard, she said, "He is doing well. The children love him, and I think he likes it at the Rock." The king was silent as the starters were replaced by the mains, which was roasted lamb with potatoes and gravy. After a few bites, he spoke again. "That is good. It is important that the North is more integrated into the realm. Tywin is the one person I trust to make the North come back properly into the kingdoms." Joanna nodded. She remained silent then and listened to other strains of conversation. Something to do with Lady Merryweather having taken ill. Lord Celtigar being caught in bed with Lord Roseby's wife. All the usual gossip that bored her, but was important to building a solid defense against the court. Eventually, the mains were removed and dessert was put before them. Joanna saw Jaime Eddard listening in rapt attention as Prince Racker spoke about something in great detail that involved moving his hands a lot. She smiled at the sight. Then there was Cersei speaking animatedly to Princess Shaena and Princess Daenerys. Things were going very well. The musicians started playing then, as people started finishing their desserts. The king led his wife out to dance, and then Tywin led her out to dance. They switched partners after a twirl or two. The king did nothing inappropriate for a change, and Joanna was beginning to think that things were normal again, like how they were before Summerhall. The dancing continued for a long time, by which point the children had been taken to bed. Eventually the evening finished, and Tywin walked back with her to their chambers. The king remained behind in the throne room, drinking and laughing. They checked in on the children. Aemma and Cersei were fast asleep, and Eddard was reading. She kissed them all goodnight, and then walked back to her in Tywin's rooms. As they were getting changed, Joanna said, "Did you know Lord Rickard originally wanted to send Eddard to the Vale? Did Abrios tell you that?" Tywin asked. "Yes," Joanna replied. She sensed her husband was about to tell her something that would contradict the king. "Then he is either lying or saying something that Rickard hid from me. As far as I know, Rickard only approached me, not Jon Arryn, and the king had nothing to do with it." Tywin said simply. Joanna nodded. "I suspected as much. The king rarely gets involved in such things." Her husband sighed. "Until he does," and they both remained silent, knowing what he meant by that, and the fact that Stefan had not been at court for a decade. The ground was packed full of people, nobles, merchants, and commoners. That's what Ned had told him, and Jaime believed him. He could see it all from where he was sat in the royal box, but really, he was more interested in staring down at the place where the jousting would happen. Ned had said that knights had come from across the realm for the tourney, which was being held to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the king's ascension to the throne. From what Ned had told him, ascension meant becoming king. Jaime did not really understand why they didn't just say that instead of using such fancy words. Then again, he did not really understand why adults used so many big words to begin with anyway. The roar of the crowd subsided and drew his attention firmly to where a royal herald was now standing. The man wore the red and black of the royal family, and he was a slightly portly man. Jaime could see the sweat on the man's head from where he was sitting. The man's voice was loud and clear, even though a hush had fallen over the stands. "Your Majesties, lords and ladies, people of King's Landing, welcome to the tournament to celebrate His Majesty, the King's ascension to the throne. Today we have the jousting, tomorrow the melee. There are many competitors who have come to compete for the prize that is being awarded. The first two jousters are Ser Barristan Selmy of the Kingsguard and Ser Terence Toyne." The herald stepped off the platform and walked away. Jaime looked at Ned, who was sat to his right, and grinned. His brother grinned back at him. The crowd had begun chattering away again, even from the royal box. Jaime could sense the excitement and the anticipation that was building in the ground. The two knights appeared. Ser Barristan looked like a knight from a song, dressed in gleaming white armor, white cloak fluttering behind him. Ser Terence Toyne was from an old and disgraced house. His clothes were threadbare, but he had pride. That's what Ned had said to him before they had entered the tourney ground. Both men stood before the royal box and bowed. Jaime saw the king wave his hand, and both men moved back to their respective places, mounting their horses and taking a lance from their squires. Iatro felt his heart speed up as the crowd fell silent. This was exciting. This was what he'd been looking forward to ever since Papa and Mama had said they were going to King's Landing. The two knights looked at one another, and then they spurred their horses toward one another. Yaitaro leaned forward in his seat and watched as their lances missed one another. They rode past one another, and then turned around and rode back toward one another. This time, Sir Barristan's lance was true, and Sir Terence was knocked off his horse. The crowd roared in approval, and Yaitaro cheered with them. Sir Barristan stopped his horse and handed his lance to his squire. He then got down from his horse and helped Sir Terence up off the ground. Jaime watched as the two men walked off the field, and two new competitors entered. The herald stepped forward and named them as Sir Lewis of Maidenpool and Sir Geoffrey Rivers. Jaime watched as the two knights bowed and then took their positions on their horses. They rode past one another the first time, and then a second time, then a third time. On the fourth time, Sir Lewis, who wore purple and green, broke his lance against Sir Geoffrey's, and had to take a new lance. On the fifth pass, Sir Lewis was knocked off his horse. The crowd clapped politely. Jaime looked at Ned, who nodded in response to his unasked question. That meant that Sir Geoffrey would face Sir Barristan in the next round. A few more knights came forward with unremarkable names, but Jaime watched them joust with fascination. This was his first big tournament. He'd not seen one at the Rock, at least not one he could remember. There'd been a tourney when he'd turned 1 and when he'd turned 3, but he could not remember them, so they did not count. The herald seemed to be more and more loose of tongue. His words were slurred and Ned was laughing slightly. Jaime leaned in and asked, "What's so funny?" Ned looked over to where Mama and Papa were frowning and whispered, "He's drunk." Rosier's eyebrows rose. "What's drunk?" he asked. Ned smirked. Before Jaime could ask anything more, the herald came forward and announced, "Now we are on to the next round. Sir Barristan is to compete against Sir Geoffrey Rivers." Jaime immediately leaned forward. He looked at Cersei, but she was busy staring at the prince. She'd been doing that ever since they'd come to the capital. It was a little annoying. Jaime turned back to the action on the ground and cheered when Cersei Barristan knocked Sir Geoffrey off his horse in the first tilt. Jaime watched the other tilts, but with less interest. Now he was happy Sir Barristan would be competing in the final. He could rest easy. Ned, however, kept up a constant feedback of the action. Jaime listened as Ned talked about the form of the jousters, their space between lance and horse, and their action. None of it really made sense to Jaime, but he nodded along and hummed in agreement. Eventually, Ned fell silent when it came to the final. Sir Barristan Cersei against his fellow Kingsguard brother, Sir Gawain Gaunt. The Uzier of Gawain Gaunt was a big bull of a man. As far as Jaime could see, he was like a bull or an ox. He said this to Ned, and his brother just laughed in agreement. The two knights bowed before the king and then mounted their horses. On the first pass, they missed one another. On the second, they broke their lances. On the third, they broke their lances again. On the fourth, they hit one another. On the fifth, they broke their lances. On the sixth, they hit one another. The crowd was cheering, roaring for their favorites. Yaxley was not sure who to support. His hero was Sir Barristan, but Sir Gawain was giving him a good run for show. On the seventh pass, they broke their lances again. Even the king was paying attention now. Jaime could tell because Papa was looking at the king with his lord's face. On the eighth pass, they hit one another, and someone grunted. The crowd was coming alive now, cheering and chanting. Jaime was enraptured by it all. There were some strange smells wafting up from the crowd now. The sun was lowering itself in the sky. Jaime watched and then brought himself back to focus on the events unfolding below. As another set of lances were broken, he turned to Ned and whispered, "Has this ever happened before?" His brother nodded. "Once, long, long ago." Jaime wants to ask when, but then a roar goes up from the crowd, and his head snaps back to the action. Sir Gawain has knocked Sir Barristan's lance from his hand with the power of his blow. Sir Barristan grabbed another lance, and they are back at it. Again they go, and again it happens. Again and again, until Sir Gawain is somehow knocked from his horse. The crowd cheers and groans in equal measure. Sir Barristan does a round around the ground and then stops and dismounts, walking with his sworn brother to stand before the king. The crowd falls silent then, and the king stands. "We have had a delightful tournament so far. The men who have competed in the jousting have done themselves and their king proud. And these two knights before me, knights of the King's Guard, have done themselves very proud. I recognize Sir Barristan as the champion. The crowd roared with approval. Jaime roared alongside them. Sir Barristan kneeled before the king, and then said, "Your Majesty, with your approval I would like to donate my winnings to the Charity of Our Lady." Jaime had read about the Charity of Our Lady. It was a charity dedicated to protecting ladies who had lost loved ones in war. The king smiled. "Your request is granted, sir." The crowd roared, and then they all stood as the king and queen walked out of the box. Yaxley turned his attention back to the ground, which was slowly emptying out, now that the king and queen had left. He was surprised when he heard the chairs around him moving. He turned and saw the prince standing there, dressed in red and black, with his hair tied behind his back. Yaxley bowed alongside Ned and father. "Lord Tywin, I hope you do not mind if I take your son and foster son out for a little tour of the Red Keep." Excitement bloomed in Jaime. The sun was still up, though it was slowly lowering, but the prince was asking to show him and Ned around the Red Keep. That was something. Jaime turned to look at Papa and saw him smile briefly. "Of course, my prince." The prince smiled in return and said, "I promise to return them to you before the evening meal." Papa nodded, and with that, the prince turned and walked away. Jaime looked at Ned, who shrugged and walked after the prince. Jaime did the same. Once they had caught up with the prince, he spoke. "How much have you seen of the Red Keep, Jaime Eddard?" "Not much, your majesty," Ned said softly. "We have mainly been in our rooms or in the throne room." The prince nodded. "I see, and please, call me Rhaegar, or your highness, if you must. Your majesty is my father." Jaime grinned at the slight blush that appeared on Ned's face. "What do you want to show us, your highness?" Jaime asked, unable to keep the eagerness from his tone. The prince stopped walking and looked at Jaime. He gestured to the white shadow at his back. "This is Sir Jonathor Derry, my sworn sword and a knight of the Kingsguard. Do you wish to go to White Sword Tower and meet the Kingsguard, or do you wish to explore the passages under the Red Keep?" Jaime looked at Ned. The thought of meeting the Kingsguard was an exciting one. He had dreamed of meeting the famous knights of Westeros for as long as he could remember, but he also knew that there were things under the Red Keep worth exploring, things that would make Cersei jealous. He turned to Ned, and his brother asked the prince, "How long would it take to explore the passages, your highness?" The prince grinned. "Longer than the time we have until dinner." Ned seemed to do the thinking then, very quickly, his eyes moving back and forth. Then he looked at Jaime and raised an eyebrow. Jaime smiled and nodded eagerly. Ned turned to the prince and said, "Perhaps going to White Sword Tower would not be a bad idea, your highness." The prince grinned again. "Very well, come with me." The prince walked quickly, and so they did as well, Martin Castle and Sir Jonathor walking behind them. They walked and walked. They crossed over one bridge and then another and then another. Finally, they arrived outside White Sword Tower, where there were gold cloaks standing guard outside. They bowed before the prince and then nodded to Sir Jonathor. The doors were opened for them, and then they walked in, up the stairs to the ground level. Here the prince stopped and said, "This is the table of the White Swords. It is where they come to sit and relax and talk. Sir Jonathor, perhaps you could get your sworn brothers." The knight nodded and headed up the stairs visible in the corner. The prince looked at them and then asked, "How did you find the jousting?" Yaxley could not help himself then. The prince had asked him a question and he had the answer. "I loved it. It was fabulous and brilliant, and Sir Barristan was amazing. So was Sir Gawain." The prince grinned again. "And you, Eddard?" Ned's reaction was more subdued. "I liked the jousting. It was good to see everything I've read put into practice." The prince nodded. "Yes, I have been told that you like to read a lot. If you wish tomorrow, I could show you the Royal Library. There are some books there that I think you would love." Before Jaime or Ned could ask what the prince meant, Sir Jonathor came down the stairs, accompanied by Sir Barristan and Sir Gawain. Both were dressed in new suits of white armor and white cloaks. They looked tired, but they were standing still. Both men bowed when they saw the prince, and Sir Barristan asked, "What might we do for you, your highness?" The prince looked at the two knights, then at Jaime and said, "Young Jaime here had a few questions for you both. I was wondering if you might answer them, if you are of course not tired." Jaime felt his heart go into his throat, then Sir Barristan nodded. "Of course, my prince." Sir Gawain and Sir Barristan sat down in chairs to the right and left of the prince. Sir Jonathor remained standing. The prince smiled, turned to Jaime and said, "Now, whatever questions you have for the two fine Sarahs, you may ask." Yanni swallowed. His throat was suddenly dry. He took a breath, then another one, then another one. Finally, he asked, "What was it likely jousting against each other today?" Sir Gawain spoke then. "It was excellent. Most of the time, only one Kingsguard may compete in a tourney. That usually means that the competition is not always what it should be. But today was excellent. It was actually quite challenging." "Why is only one Kingsguard allowed to joust in a tourney?" Ned asked. "By law, the Kingsguard are sworn to protect the king and the royal family," Sarah Barristan explained. "You cannot have the Kingsguard relaxing from that duty for a minute. However, in tourneys with the gold cloaks present as well, it is usually permissible for one Kingsguard to compete and represent the king, as was the case today. Today, however, the king allowed myself and Sarah Blaine to compete, due to his belief that the crown needed more representation." Jaime was not sure he understood that explanation, but Ned did, so he nodded as well and asked, "What's it like being in the Kingsguard? When did you join the Kingsguard? How did you feel being asked to join the Kingsguard?" The two knights before him laughed slightly, and it was Yaime's turn to blush. Saber turned to blush. Saber turned and spoke first. "I joined the Kingsguard 12 years ago during the reign of King Jakartaris II, the father of King Rakataris. To be in the Kingsguard is the greatest honor a knight can have. To serve one's king is to serve one's kingdom. To protect the royal family is to protect the future and hopes of Westeros. There is no higher calling for a knight. As to how I felt being asked to join the Kingsguard, I was honored." Sir Gawain smirked. "I joined the Kingsguard 2 years after Sir Barristan did. I joined after defeating the rogue pirate king. As Sir Barristan has said, it is an honor to serve in the Kingsguard, and an honor and a solemn duty to protect the embodiment of Westeros." Jaime nodded enthusiastically and then asked, "What was it like fighting in the War of the Ninepenny Kings?" He knew Papa had fought in that war, but Papa had never mentioned it before, and Jaime really wanted to know what it was like fighting against the last of the Blackfires. Sir Barristan spoke then. "It was an interesting experience. The Golden Company are one of the finest bands of soldiers known to man, and they also know how to command in battle, which is rare for sellswords. Usually they are a mess of men and weapons. Melee's Blackfire was a brute. With 2 heads and many arms, he was a hard foe, and he fought well, but he was defeated like any other man." Yadami nodded and went to ask another question, but before he could, Prince Rhaegar spoke. "Thank you very much for your time, Sarah Chiez. I believe it is time we left to allow you get ready for the evening feast, and to ensure that we too are ready for the evening feast. Come, yea, nay, Eddard." The prince got up and walked down the stairs, accompanied by Ser Jonathor. Jaime and Ned did the same. The prince was silent on the walk back. He dropped them off at Mama and Papa's rooms and bid them farewell. Ned nodded to Jaime and walked to his own room, leaving Jaime to knock on Mama and Papa's door. The door opened and Mama was sat on the bed. She smiled when she saw him. "How was it, sweetling?" "We met Sir Barristan and Sir Gawain of the Kingsguard, Mama. It was really brilliant. We saw the White Sword Tower from the inside, and we spoke to them as well. They were very nice and charming like knights from the song." Jaime gushed. Mama gestured for him to join him on the bed, and so he did. She kissed the top of his head and asked, "And how was the prince, sweetling?" "He was nice, Mama," Jaime said. The prince had an air of authority about him. Authority, that was the word Ned would use. Jaime pulled back and looked at Mama and said, "When I'm older, I want to join the Kingsguard, Mama." As he said it, he knew he meant it with all his heart. The council chamber in the Red Keep was always something that Tywin dreaded sitting in. It was hot and stuffy, no doubt reflecting Aerys' desire to show everyone just how much of a dragon he truly was. That was an old argument, one that Tywin had long since acknowledged he would never win. That did not mean, however, that he would simply sit down and allow himself to sweat to stink. He always had a window open to allow some of the heat to go out, and whenever the king bothered to attend council meetings, he seemed to allow it to stand. Which was why Tywin was currently feeling a cool breeze on his neck. It was nice and refreshing, despite the lateness of the hour. The entire council was present this evening. The king had called for an emergency meeting and had been the first one in the room, just before Tywin. Ser Gerald Hightower, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, was present, sat to the king's left. Tywin was sat to the king's right. Then there was Lord Velaryon, the king's cousin, an ambitious man and one who no doubt hoped to see his son wed to one of the princesses. He would not have that chance if Tywin had his way. Then there was Lord Staunton, master of laws, but very good at looking the other way when the city watch did some wrong or the other. He was on Tywin's payroll, had been for some time. Pyxelles, as Grand Maester, was Tywin's ally, family as well through some distant cousin. Carson Chalstead was Aris man, as master of coin. He was not a lick spittle, but he knew his duty, and that was good. Then there was the strange master of whispers, Sarajaxaris Waters. Tywin did not know the bastard's origins. No one apart from the king did, and the king kept that secret hidden to his chest. Always had done. The king spoke, and Tywin stopped his musings. I have summoned you all here because there are 3 things I wish to discuss. First and foremost is Braavos. The Titan is growing restless again. Tell me, Chalstead, what was it they had said? There was a dangerous note in the king's voice, and Tywin suspected that whatever it was that had been written to the king, it was not good news. Gutstead hesitated, and Tywin knew his suspicions were right. Eventually, the man spoke, his voice deep and uneasy. Your Majesty, Braavos is demanding that the repayment of the loans taken out by His Majesty King Jacaerys be repaid immediately. Should payment be delayed, they will be forced to take immediate and swift action. Tywin grimaced. Braavos never knew how to write to the King of the Seven Kingdoms. He remembered his lessons and how many wars had nearly been started during the short reign of Daenerys the Young Dragon. Because of Braavos's poor wording, a trend that had continued during the reign of King Aegon the Unworthy and King Megar. They seek to threaten a crowned and anointed king. Have they forgotten what happened the last time they did that? Tywin remembered. The entire council remembered. They had all been there when Braavos had threatened the king's grandfather, King Aegon the Fortunate. Braavos had been sacked and burned. I will not let them push me around, nor will I let them demand things from me. Tell me, Chalstead, when does the loan period expire? In 5 years, Your Majesty, Chalstead said. And how much money is the currently outstanding on the loan? The king asked. 150,000 dragons, Your Majesty, Chalstead said. And we have, what was it? 300,000 dragons in the treasury, correct? The king demanded. Before Chalstead could answer, Tywin answered. Yes, Your Majesty. To pay off the loan now would mean we have half that amount of money left, and therefore not enough to pay for the refurbishment of the roads that had been planned. The king looked at him intently, and Tywin felt himself shiver internally before cursing himself. The king was not a god, he was a man. He was not king. Aegon, nor was he King Maekar. He was Aerys, Tywin's childhood friend. The king looked at him and continued looking at him. The silence grew deafening, until eventually the king spoke. Then I will not repay the loan. I must advise against that, Your Majesty. Tywin said at once. If you refuse to repay the loan, then the Iron Bank will send its agents for you, and they will not be as kind as the current emissaries have been. There were rumors about servants of the Iron Bank, the ones who had been formed when the bank had been, who were older than Braavos itself. The rumors were not good ones. The king did not seem as if he believed Tywin. You think they would dare send a hired hand to kill a crowned and anointed king? Tywin shook his head. No, Your Majesty. They are not foolish enough to do that, but they would send someone to harm Your Majesty's family. A servant can be disguised as someone. A guard, for example. They would go undetected, and then slip the blade in. The king presses his hands together. I will not bend to the demands of bankers. I will not allow them to push for something that I cannot give them. Tywin was about to offer to pay for the loan amount himself, but then Staunton spoke. Perhaps Your Majesty need not do anything of the sort. You need not pay the loan back, nor need you declare war. Tywin looked at Staunton, wondering what the man was getting at, and then it hit him. What do you mean? The king asked, intrigued. Volantis, Lys, Myr, and Tyrosh. All of these cities, despite Braavos, all of them are Braavos' biggest traders. Sign an agreement with them, and you cut off Braavos' source of income. You cut off the Iron Bank's hand. Without the money from there, they do not have the money to pay their hired hands, Staunton said. It was a smart plan, Tywin had to admit, but there was just one flaw. You assume that these cities will want to side with His Majesty with the Seven Kingdoms. They have no reason to. He gestured at the books before him. Volantis has only a 2% trade with the Seven Kingdoms compared to a 20% trade with Braavos. Lys is only 4%, whilst Myr is 8%. They have not got the incentive to strike a trade deal that harms them more than it does Braavos. Staunton was silent a moment. Then he said, And you do not seem to understand the symbolic nature of such a gesture. Yes, they might not want to do it, but when Volantis hears that the city descended from slaves is demanding something of the blood of old Valyria, how do you think they will react? Tywin understood then that was the one area he had struggled with since the Reigns, the symbolic gestures that meant more to bankers and peasants than they did with lords. He looked at the king and saw approval. Quickly, he changed his tune. Say that Volantis agrees. Lyse and Myre are sworn enemies of Volantis and of each other. They might despise Braavos, but they hate each other more. To convince them to side with each other and the throne against the Titan will be a feat unto itself. Staunton nodded in agreement. This is true, but should we get Volantis and Tyros on board, then we have significant weight against Braavos and more than enough leverage to force Myre and Lyse to think that we might consider weighing in on the disputed lands. Tywin nodded, conceding the point. The king smirked. It seems we have our solution. Tywin, I want you to write to Volantis and Tyrash. Inform them of what is being done by Braavos and the Iron Bank. Make it clear that they are doing things beyond the bounds of the old treaty, and make sure you include just how loathsome they are being. Tywin nodded and made a note of that. He would need to change the wording. He knew the Triarchs of Volantis. They would not take too well to having the King of the Seven Kingdoms demand anything of them, regardless of whether or not he was of old Valyria. Chelstead then spoke. Your Majesty, the emissaries from the Iron Bank will be here until the end of the week, waiting for an answer. What should I tell them? The king's smirk grew wider. You tell them the truth. I will not be paying their bank anything. They do not demand anything from the dragon. You tell them to return to their own city and to handle their master's displeasure as it was. There was a brief pause, then the king spoke again. Sarx Jaehaerys, tell me, is our source in Braavos still active? Sir Jaehaerys nodded. He is, Your Majesty. Active and alert, awaiting command, and desperately hoping for a chance at revenge. The king nodded. Very well. I want you to tell him that the time has come. He is to do as he was instructed originally, and to proceed as he was told. When the time is right, he will be rewarded. Sir Jaehaerys nodded, made a note of that, and then spoke. Your Majesty, there is one other thing I wish to speak about. The king gestured for the knight to continue. My sources tell me the Golden Company has made base in Loreth once more. What of it? Lord Losier's Fethorion said. There are no more Blackfires to carry on the work of that traitor Daemon. They have no purpose. Sir Jaehaerys ignored the Lord of the Driftmark, and instead focused on the king. Your Majesty, my sources tell me that they are working with a cheesemonger and a man known only as the Kindly Man, and it seems that they are plotting something. A Blackfire girl was recently married off, the daughter of Mexley the monstrous cousin Daemon. She married a wealthy Pentoshi noble. The king leaned forward intently. Do you think they mean to take a claim then, and use the girl and her connection to the Golden Company? Sir Jaehaerys sighed. I am not sure, Your Majesty. The information I have been receiving is mixed and confused. There are signs that they are definitely planning something. This noble the Blackfire girl married is descended from another of King Aegon the Unworthy's bastards. And as such, the uniting of two such claims either means two things. They are going to try for the throne, or they are going to try for Pentos. At this Staunton spoke. Why would they try for Pentos? Because Pentos has always been in the mind of those who would serve traitors, Tywin said. It is a place where opportunity can grow, a place whose economy is growing by 3% every year. There is a fortune to be made in Pentos, and if someone were to rule Pentos, well then they would be very, very rich. Sir Jaehaerys nodded in agreement. Lord Tywin is correct. The chances are that this marriage is preceding an attack on Pentos. Should Pentos fall, the balance of power in Western Essos will shift. And then the Braavosi will be the least of our concerns, the king concluded. Exactly, Your Majesty, Sir Jaehaerys said. My advice would be to send someone after this newly married couple and kill them before they can do anything other than fuck. Should they produce a child, you can guarantee that there will be war in Essos. Tywin could tell that the king was torn between wanting to let there be war in Essos and a genuine fear that war in Essos could destroy his only carefully constructed plans. Eventually, the king sighed. Very well. Have our men handle this situation as bloodlessly as possible, or rather, as quietly as possible. Sir Jaehaerys nodded. The king took a deep breath and then said, Now then, if there is nothing else that anyone wishes to discuss, I think it would be best if we retired for the evening. There was a moment of silence, and then Peetzel spoke. Actually, Your Majesty, there is something I think that needs addressing. It concerns the Citadel. Tywin leaned forward then, as did Aerys. It was a habit from the days when they were two young men against the world. The Citadel had both fascinated and terrified them. "What is it?" the king asked, cautiously. Though Tywin knew he was just as excited, Pyxell brought the letter out of his robes, and not for the first time Tybkira wondered what else was stored within those robes. He unfurled the letter and read aloud. "To Graham Esther, Pyxell, we write to you to inform you that there have been surprising developments within the lower levels of the Citadel, as of late. Murmurs have reached our ears that 2 or 3 maesters are practicing things that they should not be, things which break the king's peace." Tywin chanced to look at the king, and for a moment it was like they were boys again. Discussing theories which everyone else dismissed, there was a spark in the king's eye, but then it was gone. His voice was indifferent. "And what things are these that these men were practicing, that breaks the peace?" Here Pycelle hesitates and glances at Tywin. Tywin nods, encouraging the man to speak. He needs to know. He needs to know he was right. Bringing the dead back to life and reciting from books, banned under King Baelor. That ban was overturned by King Maker. Tywin thought to himself, judging by the look on the king's face, which disappeared just as quickly as it had appeared. The king had thought the same. The king's voice was dispassionate when he spoke. "Have these men been apprehended and put into the custody of crown officials?" Pyxell shifted again. They have been remanded in custody by the maesters of the Citadel, pursuant to further investigation." Tywin did not look at the king, for he did not want his feelings to become obvious. But now he was really getting quite suspicious. The king did not contain his astonishment. "What more is there to investigate? If they committed these crimes, then they must be handed over to crown officials and tried as such. That is the law." Pyxell shifted and turned his hands over and over. I am aware, Your Majesty. However, the Citadel has certain precautions it takes when maesters of noble blood are involved. One of the culprits was the son of Lord Beesbury, and the other the bastard son of Lord Bracken. Therefore, it was seen as prudent to allow them a proper investigation. Tywin thought about that for a moment, recalling what he had read as a young boy. The book had mentioned Beesbury and Bracken as being responsible for something, but what it was he could not quite place. The king was not pleased. "I do not care who they are. If they have broken the law, they must be punished by the law. I want you to write to the Citadel and tell them that they are to hand over these 2 men to the Baelies." Pycelle nodded, somewhat abashed. "Of course, Your Majesty." Tywin saw him make a note of that, and then he fell silent. The king nodded, seemingly happy with that. "Now then, with that out of the way, I think we can dissolve this meeting. Tywin remained behind. The rest of you may go." Tywin sat where he was, to the king's right, feeling the eyes of the other council members on him as they wondered what it was he had done. Tywin himself had not exact idea. He was not even sure the king wanted to see him about something he had done wrong. For there was no malice in the king's eyes, there was nothing there. Perhaps Cerys had finally learned to keep his expression vacant. Once the last council member was gone and it was just the 2 of them and Ser Geralt, the king spoke. "Tell me, what do you make of this development?" Tywin did not need to ask the king what he meant. He took a breath, considered his thoughts, and then said, "I think we were right, Your Majesty. I think there is more happening in the Citadel than meets the eye, and I think we might have just found a way to exploit that." "So, you agree with me then?" the king asked, unable to contain his excitement. "You believe we should use Beesbury's boy and Bracken's son to find out the truth of the undercurrent?" Tywin nodded. "I do, Your Majesty. I think we would be foolish not to." Pycelle was squirming around whenever this was being talked about. I have not seen him that unnerved since the time we discussed Summerhall in front of him. The king's eyes narrowed. Can he be trusted? Pycelle? Tywin thought for a moment and then replied, "As far as I think it suits him, yes. Other things must be kept under wraps. He will send that letter, but no doubt he will send others, warning them." The king nodded. "Very well. I trust you will remind him of why it is good to serve the crown, not the Citadel." Tywin bowed his head. "Of course, Your Majesty." The king smiled, and Tywin saw his friend then. The boy Aerys had been before the burden of the crown. "I received a letter from Stefan," he said. "He would come to court briefly next year." There was hope in the king's voice. Aerys' voice, and Tywin smiled. "It would be good to see him," Tywin admitted. The king smiled. "I agree. Now go, return to your wife." Tywin bowed, and then straightened and walked out of the council chamber. Perhaps things would not be as bad as he had feared. The great hall and the throne room sparkled with light and life. Lorza and her contingent and Lord Hoster and his contingent had finally come to King's Landing after a few weeks of delay. Joanna was happy to have the chance to speak to her old friend again. Even if it was the day before she and the children left for the Rock, Lorza glowed in a dress of orange and black, her hair tied in a simple knot. Her husband was at her side, dressed in the same colors. He looked handsome, as he always had. The Queen was sat next to Joanna and was dressed in gold and green, and looked beautiful. Rosier always had looked beautiful, and she was smart as well. The King was sat next to Tywin, discussing something or the other, no doubt the recent controversy involving the Citadel. The Queen's voice drew her from her musings. "So, tell me, Joanna, how are you finding King's Landing?" The Queen's voice was soft, but Joanna could hear the question clear as day. She remembered the reason for her leaving King's Landing, and sighed internally. Externally, however, she put a smile on her face and said, "It has been fun. It is nice to have come back once more, to explore the sights of childhood. I hope the children have not caused too much trouble." She knew that Cersei had been all but attached at the hip to Princess Shaena, whilst Jaime had followed Prince Rhaegar around constantly asking questions. The Queen chuckled softly. "Oh, not at all. It is nice to have other children in the Red Keep. I know that Rhaegar can sometimes feel somewhat lonely without another boy to talk with. Having 2 boys, now 3, has definitely been good for him." Joanna nodded, and then seeing that Loreza was listening in as well, she asked, "Loreza, how are you finding King's Landing?" Loreza had always been the older of the 3 of them, the more experienced in all sorts of things, and the first to get married. Loreza smiled. "I think it is just as I remember it, full of intrigue and all sorts of mischief. In short, I am very much enjoying it." There was a brief pause, and then Loreza continued, "And I know that Lord Dane greatly appreciated Prince Rhaegar asking Arthur to squire alongside him." The Queen smiled, her mouth crinkling slightly. "That is good. I know Rhaegar likes Arthur very much, and I hope they can become friends." There was a brief pause, and then the Queen leaned in and conspiringly whispered, "I saw Sir Bonifer a few days ago." Joanna leaned in, intrigued. There had been rumors when they were girls that Sir Bonifer had held a candle for the Queen, but Rhaenyra had never returned his affections, but she had used them once or twice to her and the Crown's advantage. It was with some control that Joanna asked, "Did you say anything to him?" Rhaenyra shifted, twisting her hand slightly. "Well, I didn't, but he did. He spoke at great length about the folly of youth. I think he might well have been drinking. He was never the most articulate of people." Lord Zier laughed. "Oh, that much is true. Do you remember that time during Prince Duncan's name day tourney when he and Sir Bonifer decided to drink each other under the table? Prince Duncan was stilled, whilst the good Sir was mumbling about dragons and foxes." Joanna giggled, and the Queen did as well. "I remember that one well," Joanna said. That was the tourney where Tywin had first asked her to dance, and the sparks had flown. "Well, he apologized about, as well as the fact he took vows of celibacy." The Queen replied, grinning slightly, "He was quite drunk when I saw him." Joanna feigned shock, but she had always thought that Sir Bonifer was too much of a drunk and a flirt to ever truly change his ways, unless he was fighting a battle. "So, did you reply to him?" she asked. The Queen shook her head, looking slightly sad. "No, but I sent Sir Gawain to make sure that the knight returned home safely. I could not speak to him. Far too many years have passed, and I am not the same girl I was when last I considered him." Joanna nodded, as did Lorasa. They both understood that. Lorasa then said, "I heard some girl or the other talking about Lady Celtigar. Apparently she's been sleeping with the stable hand." "She has," the Queen said. "Lord Celtigar is an old man who wishes to slip peacefully from this world. His son is an old man as well, and he wants the woman killed. She is not his mother, but was meant to be his bride before his father and the king decided otherwise. Apparently he wanted to sleep with her himself, and she said no, so that's why he always looks so angry," Joanna said. "He always looks as if his sigil has come and grabbed him by the bollocks." Lorzia howled with laughter, and the Queen smiled, and for a moment Joanna felt comfortable, as if she was a girl again, back with the 2 closest friends she had, and not a care in the world. "I know that Lady Staunton's daughter is currently trying to sleep with Lord Valerian's son, something to do with a bet she made with Morena Stokeworth," the Queen said. "Isn't Lord Valerian's son, the one who wants to be nothing more than another sea snake, come again?" What makes Staunton's daughter think she can ever get him to look at her? Lurza asked. Joanna laughed. You have seen her, right, Lurza? She's possibly the most beautiful young girl at court other than the princesses. If Valerian doesn't see that, then he is blind. And not even the sea snake was blind. I think it might have more to do with the fact that Lord Valerian wants his son to marry one of my girls. The queen said, then suddenly forlorn. That would be a terrible marriage. Joanna sensed the concern in the queen's voice and placed a comforting hand on the queen's hand. Is Lord Valerian truly as bad as they make him out to be? The queen sighed. He is worse. He is family. That is true, but he is more grasping and ambitious than his own father and brother were. I think he suffers from a problem of not being them, and therefore he feels the need to make up with it, with all of this anger and scheming. Joanna hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether it was her place to ask this question. Then, deciding that, as a friend of the queen and a mother, if for no other reason, she said, Why then would His Majesty, the king, keep Valerian? If he knows how dangerous the man is, the queen laughed. Daenerys does not care how dangerous Valerian is. He cares for the fact that Valerian kisses the ring and ensures that the royal fleet is kept in order. So long as he is not siding with anyone else, Daenerys is happy. And so Valerian's power at court grows, and nothing gets done to check it. Joanna thought for a moment, and looked over to where Tywin was now speaking to Grandmaster Pachel, and she said, I will speak with Tywin if anyone can get His Majesty to reconsider his position on Valerian. It will be Tywin. The queen nodded, and then music started. A slow, steady rhythm that was meant to bring people to the floor to dance. The king appeared and took the queen's arm, and they began weaving away across the floor. Joanna sighed for a moment and said to Loreza, They look happy, don't they? Lorgia hummed in agreement. Oh, most definitely. A much better sight than what we saw at their wedding. Joanna nodded. The image of a tearful Rhaella and a very angry Aerys flashed through her mind. It had not been a good day. The king had looked somewhat heartbroken, and Prince J.R.S. had insisted it happen, despite all common sense saying otherwise. Joanna had never forgiven King J.R.S. or Queen Shea for their hypocrisy in forcing their son and daughter to marry one another, when they themselves had married for love. But now, looking at the king and his queen dancing and laughing, perhaps they had been right to do so. Perhaps there were stronger bonds in the Targaryen family than she had first thought. Eventually the dancing picked up pace, and it was then that Tywin got off his seat and asked her to dance. They didn't speak much, they didn't need to. The dancing and their actions throughout the dance said all they needed to say. They moved as one, perfectly in sync with one another. They and the royal couple danced and weaved through the other dancers. She knew there were people looking at them, but she did not care. The two most powerful creatures in the kingdom were dancing, lions and dragons. It was only right that the others look and take note of this. She took a break from dancing to escort her children back to their beds. As they walked through the hallways to the children's rooms, Yame spoke. Mama, do we really have to leave tomorrow? This was an old discussion, but one which Joanna knew they needed to have. Yes, sweetling. As she expected, Jaime asked, Why, Mama? Are you not going to miss Papa? I will miss Papa, of course, but we must return to the rock. I am its lady, and you are its heir. It cannot go for too long without our presence there. And whilst your uncles are doing a good job, they are not the ones who are going to be ruling it in the future. Joanna replied. She knew what Jaime would say before he said it. She held back a laugh when he said solemnly, It is my duty as heir to the rock to learn how to rule, and how to rule well. There was a pause, and then he looked up at her eagerly. I'll still be able to write to Prince Rhaegar, won't I, Mama? Joanna looked down at her son and smiled. Of course, if the prince has said that you can write to him, then I see no reason for you not to write to him. Yaxley beamed at her. I can't believe Arthur is going to be squiring in King's Landing with the prince. Do you think I will be able to squire here when I am older? Joanna knew that was part of Tywin's plan, and so she said, I am sure something could be arranged, sweetling. They got closer to the twins' rooms, and Cersei spoke then. Mama, when we get back to the rock, what will happen? For a moment, Joanna was somewhat confused by what her daughter meant, and then she saw that they were indeed in front of the twins' room, and so she said, We shall discuss that when we return to the rock, sweetling. The door opened for them, and she helped her children get into their nightclothes and tuck them in. She kissed each of them on the forehead and then whispered, We shall be leaving early tomorrow morning, so I want you up as soon as the servants enter your room. Do you understand? Both nodded. Good night, Mama, they said in unison. Good night, sweetlings. Joanna replied. She walked out of their room and then walked into Eddard's room. Her foster son was just getting into bed when she entered. "Good night, Eddard," she said. "Good night, Lady Joanna," Eddard said sleepily. Joanna stayed until Eddard's breathing had evened out, as she knew he wanted her to, even if he did not say, and then she turned and made her way back to the feast. She and Tywin stayed at the feast for another hour and a half, before retiring for the night. The king and queen were dancing still when they left, and Joanna suspected a child would result from that. She and Tywin did not speak much as they walked back to their room, nor did they speak when they got changed and into bed. They held one another thought and drifted off into pleasant dreams. It was as if no time has passed before the light of the sun hit her in the morning, forcing her to get up and get changed. Tywin did so as well, despite her protestations. The children were changed and ready when she went to their rooms. They broke their fast in the dining room of the Tower of the Hand, in sleepy silence, Eddard reading a book as he ate. Then they made their way to where the carriage and the horses were waiting. As Joanna watched Eddard mount his horse and Martin Castle, the boy's valet, do the same, she turned to Tywin and then to the king and queen and curtsied. "Your Majesties, it has been an honor to visit you. Thank you for having us. We would welcome you to Casterly Rock and the Westerlands whenever you wish to visit." The king nodded. "Your presence here was a much-needed reprieve for both myself and the queen. I'm happy that our children have gotten on, and I hope they can remain friends throughout the time to come." The queen embraced Joanna then, and it was Rayla who whispered, "Thank you for coming, Joanna. It was lovely to see you. We must not keep it so long until we next see one another." Joanna breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that, in her words, the queen had forgiven her. She pulled back and looked at the queen and smiled. "Of course, Your Majesty, we would love to see you soon." "Quieter," she said. "You are welcome to come and visit whenever, Rayla, truly." It was Rayla who beamed at her, and the queen who smiled. The king spoke then. "We shall allow you and your husband to have a chance to say farewell, my lady." With that, the king and queen and their Kingsguard ventured back into the Red Keep, leaving her alone with Tywin apart from their retinue and the carriage and the children. Tywin kissed her hand and murmured, "I will miss you, my love, but I know you will look after the rock. In my absence, and that is what is needed right now. The rock must be strong at all times, for what is coming may be enough to destabilize all of Westeros." Joanna nodded. "Of course, my love. Do try and convince Aethys against this course of action. The Seven Kingdoms cannot afford such depravity now, not with so long of peace and the nights of summer in their bloom." It was a saying her mother had taken to saying after her father had died, and it was one she felt was very appropriate now. Tywin smiled. "I will try my best, my love." He kissed her hand once more, and then helped her up into the carriage. He closed the door and remained standing there as the carriage and their retinue made its way down the hill and toward the exit of the city and the rock. In the carriage for the first part of the journey, the twins stared out of the window, taking in King's Landing once more for a final time on this journey. Joanna had a feeling that they would be back to King's Landing before long, and truthfully, if Aerys was planning on going with his mad design, that might well be necessary. For a time there was silence in the carriage. The twins stared outside the window and then fell asleep. And so, Joanna began reading a book about Lara Rogue, the Queen of Viserys II. The queen was a sad sort of lady, in love with a boy half her age, and in a foreign land. She buried herself in her children until that no longer became enough. Then she left. She died alone and broken, never seeing her husband or children again. They left King's Landing and still the children slept. As they came into sight of the Blackwater Rush, Joanna found herself dropping off to sleep as well. She dreamt of nothing, and she was not sure how long it had been before she woke up to the sounds of their retinue coming to a stop. They were refreshing themselves. Joanna woke the twins up and led them to relieve themselves before they ate some food and then boarded the carriage again. The journey continued. Jaime fell back to sleep immediately, but Cersei stared outside the window, an intrigued look on her face. They did not speak, but Cersei eventually fell asleep once more. At one point, Eddard joined them in the carriage, and he and Jaime spoke about King's Landing and the tourney and the Kingsguard. Joanna smiled as she watched the exchange, happy that Eddard was becoming freer around them. After about a week, they made it to the Blackwater Inn. They stayed there for a day or two, eating and stretching their legs, before they got back into the carriage and continued traveling. It was another 4 days before they made it to Deep Den, and when the solid structure came into sight, Anyadi gasped and said, "We're nearly home, Mama." Joanna smiled, and they continued. The taste of home was on her mouth. They were not far. 4 days later, they arrived in Lannisport. A mere hour later, they were getting out of the carriage and ascending into the heart of the rock. Jaime and Cersei were bouncing on their feet as they made their way up. Eddard was silent, but his eyes betrayed his happiness to be back. When they got out and entered the main hall, Jaime and Cersei bounded to their uncle Geryon and embraced him. Sir Caven bowed before her and said, "The rock is yours, my lady." Joanna smiled and said, "Thank you, Sir Caven. I relieve you of your duties." Ned woke up. The sun was shining through the curtains. For a brief moment, there was a sense of uncertainty in him as he struggled to remember what had caused him to cry last night. Then he remembered it was his name day today. He was 10 summers old, and he was not in Winterfell. Ned knew it was silly, but that was quite upsetting. He missed his father, and Lya and Benjen, and even Brandon. He knew what would have happened had he been at Winterfell. There would have been a feast for breakfast. Then father would have taken him out for a ride of the fields and lands around Winterfell, and they would have shared stories and jokes until it was time for lessons. From there, Ned would get to choose whatever he wanted to learn about. Then there would be lunch, and Lya would sing to them, and then they'd get the rest of the day off. There was an ache in his chest as he thought about that. Ned knew it was silly to expect the same thing here at the Rock. There were thousands of things that Lady Joanna needed to do, and she probably didn't even know it was his name day. It wasn't like he'd told her, or anyone for that matter. Still, the ache in his chest didn't go away. Deciding he didn't want to think about this for too long, Ned got up and walked over to the bathroom. The servants were filling the tub with water when he opened the door. He nodded to them and took off his clothes. Ned put one hand on the side of the tub and helped himself into it. He stood for a moment, feeling the warm water lap at his feet, and then he slowly lowered himself into the tub properly. As the warmth from the water enveloped him, Ned let out a sigh. The past few moons had been very good. Since coming back from King's Landing, he'd learned a lot. Ned now knew more about Essos than he thought he might otherwise have learned. He also knew his way around some of the smaller passageways of the Rock, thanks to Jaime and Cersei. Cersei no longer seemed too awkward around him as she had been before. He felt at home at Rock, and whilst he had written to his father and to Lya, he did not usually miss them as much as he used to. Today was an exception. The thought of what his father and Lya would be doing today to celebrate a name day for someone who was not there forced him to sigh again. The ache was back with a vengeance. He rubbed some soap over himself, took some water and poured it over himself, before deciding to get out of the tub. Ned stood up, took a towel from one of the servants, and began toweling the water off his body. He took another breath and then wrapped the towel around himself and stepped out of the tub. He nodded his thanks to the servants and walked toward the door that would lead him back to his and Jaime's room. He stood in front of it for a moment, his hand on the doorknob. He could hear Jaime moving around in the room, and he wondered briefly if his foster brother knew that today was Ned's name day. Ned doubted it. His foster brother would only have remembered if Ned had told him, and as Ned had not told him, to expect him to know was foolish. And Ned was not foolish. He shook his head again and turned the doorknob. As the door moved, he walked through the doorway and into the room. Jaime was dressed in a green doublet and plain breeches. He smiled as he saw Ned and said, "I think we might miss breakfast, Ned." Ned took the hint. He knew how much his foster brother liked breakfast, and so he moved to the cupboard where his clothes were, and chose a gray double with trimmings of red on the edges, as well as an undershirt that was red in nature. He wore plain breeches as well. Once he was dressed, he nodded to Jaime and they walked out of their room to the great hall where breakfast was served. As they walked, Jaime was oddly silent and Ned was somewhat unnerved by it, but decided to ignore it for now. They got the great hall, to find it slightly empty. There were a few guardsmen who were there eating breakfast, but it seemed most everyone had already been or had not yet woken. Ned sighed, took his place to Jaime's right, and ate quietly. A simple fare of beans and bread. He ate and then had some juice, before putting his plate away from himself. He waited for Jaime to finish eating, then he got up and walked back to their room, where he brushed his teeth and then stopped and stood looking at himself in the mirror. The ache was still there. He missed his father and his brother and sister. He missed them terribly so, and he was not sure how to fix that. He didn't want to go back to Winterfell. He liked it here. The people were nice and kind, and he liked Jaime and Cersei. Still, he missed his family in the north. He took a breath, ran his hand through his hair, and turned and walked out of his hat to Jaime's room. Jaime had already gone for reading with Lady Joanna, and made his way to Maester Cranelin's rooms. When he got there, he knocked and entered when bid to do so. Maester Cranelin was a young man, perhaps as old as Lord Tywin himself. He smiled at Ned and bid him sit down, and so Ned did so. There was a moment of silence, and then the Maester spoke. Today, we will explore a topic you had mentioned once before, as being of interest to you, Master Eddard. We will look at the reign of Daeron the Good, or more specifically, his early reign. That surprised Eddard. I thought you said we would be continuing with the lessons on advanced herbal medicines. Not that he was complaining herbal medicine lessons were sleepworthy. Maester Craneling smiled at him. Those lessons may continue another day. For today, we shall be looking at the early reign of Daeron the Good, and how he managed to balance everything that came with being a son of Aegon the Unworthy. Tell me, Eddard, what do you know about Daeron the Good? Eddard smiled then. He had read a lot about Daeron the Good when he was in Winterfell, and therefore found it easy enough to say, he was born in the 153rd year after Aegon's conquest, the only son of Prince Aegon and Princess Daenerys. He was named after Daeron the Young Dragon. As a child, he showed more of an interest in books and learning than in war, something that greatly worried his warrior father, Prince Aegon. For Prince Aegon, according to Muncan, thought that for a prince of the blood to be truly respected, they need to be good with arms. Prince Daeron was not good with arms. He could not really defend himself, but he was smart and quick-witted, able to hold a conversation with the noted scholars of the time from the time he was 10. Craceley nodded, and what about as he got older? Eddard felt his smile widen. As a young boy, he was betrothed to Princess Mariah of Dorne. This was arranged by his cousin, King Baelor the Beloved, to ensure that there was peace with Dorne after the conquest had led to many men dying. He paused for a moment, and then said, Princess Mariah came to King's Landing when she was 16, and she married Prince Daeron in the 169th year after the conquest of Westeros. During that time, Prince Daeron grew into a more learned and cultured man compared to his father, Prince Aegon. Where Prince Aegon drank and wasted time on the jousting field, Prince Daeron devoted himself to learning and studying. And why do you think he spent so much time learning and studying? After all, it is not as if he was ever to become king. Surely, his cousin King Baelor was young and married, Maester Craneling said. Ned smirked slightly. This was an obvious answer. King Baelor was married. This is true, but he had not consummated his marriage, and he had locked his wife and her sisters in the maiden vault of the Red Keep to prevent them from tempting him into sleeping with them. He feared for his soul, and despite the pleas of his court, he resisted the urge to consummate the marriage. Ned had read that in a book in Winterfell, and had blushed when he had asked Brandon what consummating meant. Thinking about Brandon made him ache with loneliness, though, so he quickly stopped, and returned to the matter at hand. Prince Daeron was expected to inherit the throne by everyone. Prince Varys, his grandfather, was hand of the king to King Baelor, and a healthy man who got along with his grandson. Therefore, it was expected that if the line of King Baelor failed, then the line of Prince Varys had to continue. Master Craneling nodded. And when Baelor died, Viserys ascended the throne and reigned but a short while before the long and troubled reign of King Aegon IV began. This king was one who gave into his every urge and lust, doing nothing to stop the constant carnage that his whims affected onto the people he was meant to protect. Prince Daeron became the symbol of opposition to his father, and many, who could not stand the king and his whims, rallied to the prince. King Aegon died a fat and broken man, wanting war and getting nothing. Now, when Prince Daeron became King Daeron, what did he do? Ned thought about this for a moment, and then said, he was crowned king in King's Landing, and immediately summoned the small council, as any smart person would do. Then he ordered his father's ministers dismissed, because he did not wish for their corruption to taint his reign. He also purged the court of many of the hangers on that drifted to his father's court as well. Why do you think he did that? Master Craneling asked. Ned stopped and thought for a long moment. He remembered being quite surprised when he had read that bit in Winterfell, and not getting a decent explanation from father. He hesitated. I think he did it because he did not want to be associated with his father. After reading about King Aegon IV, Ned could not blame him for that. Do you think he was wise to do so? The counselors who had served King Aegon had kept the realm afloat and making money throughout the king's binges and lusts. They did nothing wrong. Was it right that the prince take his anger and frustration with his father out on them? Master Craiglan asked. Ned thought about the question for a moment. He was not sure. The counselors were tainted by their association with an unworthy king, but at the same time they did not encourage the king's lusts and ways, as far as Ned could tell, but they did not stop him either. I think that perhaps he did not need to remove all of the counselors and court members. Perhaps he could have kept some of them. But then would that not have made things worse, as his father's advisors might have started muttering against him? Krasini asked. They could have muttered against him, but they would not have been able to do anything about it. Prince Daeron became king the moment his father died. His word became law. To go against it would have been treason. Ned said firmly. Krillin was smiling, and Ned was not sure why. And there you have the problem of King Daeron's early reign. Ned raised an eyebrow, not sure he understood. What do you mean? Master Craiglan chuckled. King Daeron was so determined to differentiate himself from his father, to ensure that nobody would ever mistake him for his father, that he did the thing that he was taught never to do. He threw out the old and never thought if the new would be better placed to change it. He did it all at once and shook the core of the kingdoms. Those who were willing to give the new king a change, despite his preference for Dawn and Dawnish ways, were angered by that, and so they plotted and planned. They were determined to right an imbalance they felt had been created. Craiglan stopped speaking, then and looked at Ned intently. Ned thought over what the maester had said, and then said, so, in his haste to be different and new, he made the whole that would consume him and every other king that succeeded him until the reign of King Jacaerys. Craiglan nodded. Exactly. There was a knock on the door then, and when it opened, Martin Castle was standing there. I have come to take Master Eddard to lunch in the Great Hall per Lady Joanna's request. Eddard was surprised. He did not think lunch had come so quickly. He looked over to Master Craiglan and saw that the man was smiling. Very well, you may go, Eddard. I shall see you shortly. Surprised, Ned stood up, nodded to the maester, turned, and then walked out of the room. Martin trailing behind him, they walked in silence. Martin was not one for talking too much. That was more Jory's duty, and Jory was with Yeme, learning to read and write properly. They walked through another set of doors and then another, before coming to the Great Hall. When he entered the hall went silent, and then somewhere a lady started singing. Happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you, happy birthday, dear Eddard, happy birthday to you. The hall was full, he realized that now. Everyone was there. Lady Joanna was standing before him with a giant cake with a dire wolf on it and his name written on it. There were 10 candles on the cake as well. Jarman and Cersei were stood behind their mother beaming. Ned felt something in his throat well up. Lady Joanna smiled at him. You didn't think we'd forgotten, did you? Ned didn't know what to say. He did not think he could speak. There were tears forming in the corners of his eyes. He took a breath, a shuddering one, and smiled. Then he looked at the cake and took another breath before blowing the candles out. A huge cheer followed that, and Lady Joanna turned and walked to the great dining table, where the cake was placed. A knife was produced, and Ned, who had followed her not quite believing what was happening, was given the knife and slowly cut out a piece of cake, which he ate. It tasted nice, of sweetness, and lemon as well. He smiled and then cut a piece of cake for Giammi and a piece for Cersei. We got you presents as well, Giammi said, beaming. Ned realized then that they had all known, and he wondered how they had known. Ned was left speechless when Jaime pressed a book into his hands. He looked at it and found that it was a book he had been wanting ever since his mother had died. The Tales of Roderick Stark, the Wandering Wolf, and his family. Ned felt a lump form in his throat. His mother had told him about this book and had said she would give it to him when he turned 10, but she had not lived long enough for that. He looked at Jaime and smiled in thanks. Cersei gave him a brush, with lion and direwolf entwined, and smiled, for your hair. She giggled and Ned laughed. She often joked that his hair was wild. He was given a small sword by Martin Castle, a book by Jory, a cloak of gold and silver by Sir Kevin, a cup of gold by Sir Garyon, and a book about the rock by Sir Tiget as well. The cake was slowly disappearing as well, as more and more people came to take a slice and to eat and be merry. Ned felt that if he spoke he might cry. He had not expected this. He had thought he might need to mention it later, at the end of the day, but now, in the here and present, he did not much mind. Finally, Lady Joanna gave him her gift. It was a letter, and as he read it, he felt tears truly from in his eyes. Dear Eddard, happy name day. Thank you for being such a kind and caring young man. Thank you for being a big brother to Jaime and Cersei. Thank you for being you. We love you very, very much. Love, Lord Tywin and Lady Joanna. Ned read the letter again and then put it down. He looked at Lady Joanna and smiled, tears blurring his vision slightly. Thank you, Lady Joanna. Thank you so much. Lady Joanna held out her arms and he buried himself in her hug, crying softly. It's quite all right, Eddard. You are family. You will always be family. I love you like a son. Ned sniffled slightly, embarrassed by his crying, but also relieved that he was not being chastised for it. He nodded and whispered, Thank you. I love you too, Mother. They pulled apart then, and Ned teased Chayme for having cake in his hair, and promised to read the books he had been given and share the knowledge he had learned. But this time he did so with a smile on his face, his heart full to bursting. He was happy, so very happy this was the best named day.
Thank you for listening to the story. If you enjoyed this reimagined story and audiobook style presentation, feel free to like and subscribe for more content like this. New stories and alternate scenarios are updated regularly. Now see you in the next video.